Genesis chapter 32, verses 1 to 21. Jacob also went on his way, and the angels of God met him. When Jacob saw them, he said, "This is the camp of God." So he named that place Mahanaim. Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. He instructed them, "This is what you are to say to my lord Esau. Your servant Jacob says, I've been staying with Laban and have remained there till now. I have cattle and donkeys, sheep and goats, male and female servants. Now I am sending this message to my lord, that I may find favor in your eyes." When the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, "We went to your brother Esau, and now he's coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." In great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into 2 groups, and the flocks and herds and camels as well. He thought, if Esau comes and attacks one group, the group that is left may escape. Then Jacob prayed, "O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, 'Go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper.' I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become 2 camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers and their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted." He spent the night there, and from what he had with him, he selected a gift for his brother Esau: 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 female camels with their young, 40 cows and 10 bulls, and 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. He put them in the care of his servants, each herd by itself, and said to his servants, "Go ahead of me and keep some space between the herds." He instructed the one in the lead, "When my brother Esau meets you and asks, 'Who do you belong to and where are you going? And who owns all these animals in front of you?' Then you are to say, 'They belong to your servant Jacob. They are a gift sent to my lord Esau, and he is coming behind us.'" He also instructed the 2nd, the 3rd, and all the others who followed the herds. "You are to say the same thing to Esau when you meet him, and be sure to say, 'Your servant Jacob is coming behind us.' For he thought, I will pacify him with these gifts I'm sending on ahead. Later, when I see him, perhaps he will receive me." So Jacob's gifts went on ahead of him, but he himself spent the night in the camp.
We continue our reading from chapter 32 of Genesis, starting at verse 22 through to the end of the chapter. That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he'd sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon.
Hi everyone, morning. You joined me outside my little wood store behind me. You see it there? I'm very proud of that. A year or two back, I decided to get an axe to help me cut some wood, just a hand axe. I wanted to be able to chop up a few logs, and I turned up for the click and collect at Screwfix, and instead of getting a hand axe that I could take away, I got this beast. It's a mammoth. It's terrifying. When I use it, I have to lock the kids inside, and I'm slightly worried I'm going to put it through my shins. It's that kind of scary. And the thing is that as I was given the box with this beast in it, I knew I'd made a mistake, but yeah, I didn't say to the guy behind the counter, actually, no, I made a mistake. Can I have the hand axe that I really want? Because, I don't know. Well, why was that? Because I didn't want to appear like I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't want to appear like I wasn't a proper bloke. And, the guy behind the Screwfix looks like he's a proper bloke. And, yeah, we all do things like that, and yet we don't at the moment when we do them realise why we're doing them. It's a kind of sense of, I don't want to appear weak. I don't want to appear like I'm not reliant and able in myself. We know that from cradle to grave. The child says, "No, Daddy, I don't need your help with the breakfast cereal," as you fear clearing up Cheerios off the floor for the next 30 minutes. The parent would admit to anything apart from the fact that their children are out of control at home and they can't get them to bed and they won't eat what they're supposed to eat. The grandparent will say, "No, son, I don't need your arm to help me. I am perfectly capable on my own." We don't have to be taught self-sufficiency. We, in fact, think it's a good thing. It's the way of, we might say, blessing, that we're kind of self-made people. We can do, and that's the way we get through life. But the question is it really? Jacob's whole life, of course, has been about self-reliance. He's been grabbing and scheming and grasping after blessing, wrestling after blessing, we might say, his whole life. And this series does end, if you noticed in our reading, with an epic wrestling match. Now, when I think of wrestling, I think of back to ITV's World of Sport in the 1980s, Saturday lunchtime, and Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks. But if you're younger, it will be WWE. It's not WWF anymore. I know WWE SmackDown. Apollo Crews is it, and The Undertaker. It's that kind of thing. But it's not that kind of wrestling in a way. It's a hand-to-hand fight that goes all through the night. In fact, we're going to see this is a fight, if you think about it, that we're all involved in. And it's a fight that we have to learn how to win. And the weird thing is that we're going to learn that you win by losing. You've got to lose to win. There are two fight scenes in the passage before us. There's a fight within a fight. There's a story within a story. Around the fight between Jacob and this mysterious character is the fight between Jacob and Esau. There are two face-offs, if you like, and we need to see how do they go together to understand the whole. First of all, we've got to notice how Jacob faces up to Esau in those first 21 verses of the story. Facing up to Esau is not going to be easy, is it? The last time that Jacob saw Esau, if you like, was in the rearview mirror, as Jacob was getting away out of town as quickly as possible. And in the rearview mirror, he sees his angry brother sort of mouthing murderous threats and shaking his bow and arrow. Jacob is in trouble in that sense. But he should face Esau with some confidence, because remember last week he escaped the clutches of his mafia uncle Laban, and we knew that God was with him. And as Jacob goes home today, we also notice immediately that God is with him. Verse 1, Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. When Jacob saw them, he said, "This is the camp of God." So he named that place Mahanaim. Mahanaim means two camps. In other words, Jacob's saying, I'm surrounded by a bunch of angels here. God himself is protecting me. God is my other camp, with my camp of my family. So surely Jacob should face Esau with some confidence, particularly because of what has happened with Laban. But what we see here is that Jacob does what human beings do. He flip-flops. 1 minute he's a man of great faith, and the next minute he's a man of great fear. And that's kind of what human beings do, isn't it? We flip-flop between faith and fear. So there's the faith, Machanaim. I'm going to call it Machanaim, a place of two camps. God is with me. But then notice what happens is that Jacob starts to be afraid. He sends messengers ahead in verse 3. He sent them to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, and he said to them, "This is what you are to say to my lord Esau. Your servant Jacob says, I've been staying here with Laban, remained there until now. I have cattle and donkeys, sheep, goats, male, female servants. Now I'm sending this message to my lord that I may find favor in your eyes." In other words, he's saying, look at all the bling I've got, Esau. Don't harm me. In fact, some of this stuff might be good for you. His motive is clear. I want to find favor in your eyes, my brother. The fact is here that Jacob is still Jacob. And that's really clear when the messengers come back. We went to your brother, they say. We brought back the message that actually there's 400 men coming with him. That's a terrifying prospect, right? And Jacob does what you do when you think that God won't keep his promise. He schemes. Well, that's what he does in verse 7. He starts to get really nervous. He is frightened, isn't he? Great fear, distress. He divides the people with him into two groups, two camps. You see, God was supposed to be his camp around his camp, and now he's dividing his own camp into two because he doesn't really think that God is going to protect him after all. He thinks if Esau comes and attacks one group, the group that's left may escape. That's what we do when we're afraid. It's only after Jacob puts his plan into action that he does what he should have done all along, which is to pray. But it is an amazing prayer, isn't it? It says who God is. Oh, God of my father, verse 9, of Abraham, God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, go back to your own country and your relatives. He recognizes, first of all, who God is. And then it's a prayer that recognizes who Jacob is. I am unworthy, he says in verse 10. It recognizes what God has done, your faithfulness, he says. You've kept me, your kindness. You've kept your promise, he says. And it's only after he does all that he actually mentions what he really wants and needs, which is to save me, he says, verse 11. I pray from the hand of my brother Esau, for I'm afraid. It's a model prayer. Jacob, I don't think, could have prayed like this before, do you? When he left the land, but 20 years of being away has changed him. The difficult thing for Jacob here now is to match what he knows to be true about God, his faithfulness, his promise, with the reality of what he faces before him. And you and I know that experience, don't we? Just after he prays, he's back to scheming. See the flip-flop? I don't know how, I think I counted up in verse 13 and 14, about 550 animals that he sends in 5 different groups out towards his brother, with the message each time. Verse 18, say to him that they belong to your servant. Notice the language, your servant Jacob. They're a gift to my lord Esau. He's behind us. 5 different groups of animals, same message each time. It's a little bit more, isn't it, than stopping at the garage on the way to the relatives for some flowers and some Maltesers. We're told exactly what he's going through Jacob's mind, verse 20. He thought, I will pacify him with these gifts I'm sending on ahead. Later, when I see him, perhaps he will receive me. Flip, flop, fear, and faith. He trusts. The angels around him. Machanaim, he says. He schemes. Send the messengers ahead. Split the family into 2 camps. He trusts. An amazing prayer. He schemes. He tries to bribe and buy Esau off with a present. Jacob's so human, isn't he? His plans are an insurance policy just in case God doesn't pull through. I wonder if we found that a little bit with COVID. In the midst of tight lockdown, we pray, and then the next morning under the shower, we scheme. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Flip-flop of fear and faith. How do we get out of that 1 moment high, 1 moment low in following Jesus? It's a painful lesson, but it is the way of blessing that Jacob discovers here is you've got to lose to win. You see, Jacob thinks that his greatest need is Esau's favor. What Jacob does not realize is that the favour he needs from Esau will be answered in the favour of the one who's far greater than Esau. His greatest need is not just to face up to Esau. His greatest need is to face up to God himself. It's the greatest need of us all. And that's what we see in the second bit. He faces up to God, although he doesn't realise it initially. He's too worried, he knows to sleep. Verse 22, he sends the family and all the stuff over the river under the cover of darkness and into the promised land. And he is there outside, left alone. In verse 24, Jacob was left alone at night and in the darkness. And I think we hear echoes here of 20 years before, don't we? As Jacob left, he returns in the same way, alone, at night, nothing but the shirt on his back. And you wonder, Jacob's probably thinking, I could do with another stairway to heaven dream right now. It'd be pretty good, thanks God. But that's not what he receives at all. In fact, it's a nightmare. Suddenly in the darkness, he's jumped, isn't he? A man wrestled with him. And you're wondering, is this Esau? Whoever it is, it's a mighty fight that goes through the night. He wrestled with him until daybreak. Now, we know Jacob is strong. Remember the scene at the well when he met Rachel and he shoved away the stone. And here, notice, the man he's wrestling with cannot beat him. In verse 25, the man sees that he cannot overpower him. Jacob is a match for any man. But then in the darkness, as the limbs are flailing around, it's hard to see, but we begin to see that this is no ordinary man. Because as the man realizes he can't overcome Jacob, he does something weird. He touches the socket of Jacob's hip. Now the touch is not a move that I remember from wrestling. From the Big Daddy and the Giant Haystack days. I remember things like the clothesline and the elbow chop and the Mongolian chop and that kind of thing. But I don't remember the touch. I don't remember that one. But it seems that with just a light touch, Jacob is helpless. And we've got to get that in this story or we'll miss it completely. Because later it's a bit confusing. In verse 28, we're told that he struggled with God and overcame. He overcome. But actually, the touch move of verse 25, the fight is over. Now, I did a little research this week on dislocated hips, and I found this article in the British Journal of Sports Science, volume 38, issue number 4, if you want to check it out. They gave the example of a man who had a dislocated hip, 28-year-old man, no medical history, suffered a traumatic left hip fracture dislocation while playing recreational indoor football, they say. He was struck from behind by an opposing player, causing acute flexion and internal rotation of the hip. The fracture was reduced within 6 hours and the patient suffered no neurological injury, which is pretty good. His nerves are still going to keep working. But to put the hip back into place, this is what they had to do. A 3.5 millimeter reconstruction plate was performed using a Kocher-Langenbeck approach, whatever that is. The patient was only allowed touchdown weight bearing for 12 weeks. Get the point? The touch in verse 25 is a smackdown winning move. You don't come back from the touch move in this wrestling encounter. And the bizarre thing here is that Jacob in this moment, having been touched by this man, clings to the man. I mean, I don't know about you, but I'd be doing anything if somebody performed a touch on me to commando crawl my way out of there as quickly as I possibly could. But there is Jacob in verse 26 in the dust, clinging to the ankles of this man and begging for his blessing. That's weird, isn't it? But you see, I think as the dawn breaks, it is dawning on Jacob just who the stranger might be. And he knows he wants his blessing. So think about it, Jacob's been wrestling for blessing his whole life. His brother, his father, his uncle. But here is someone he cannot wrestle blessing from. So he pleads. But the man, notice, is not ready to give a blessing. You might actually say that Jacob is not quite ready to receive it. The man asks in verse 27, "What is your name?" And as Jacob says, Jacob, I imagine his head drops even lower into the dust, because a lifetime of sin and self is confessed in that one name, Jacob the grabber, Jacob the deceiver, Jacob the cheat. But in that confession, there's new life, newness. He said to him, verse 28, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, because you struggle with God and humans and overcome." Now, Israel's a confusing name. If you've got a footnote in your Bible, it might say something like Israel means struggles with God or God struggles. It's kind of deliberately difficult for us to get. You see, that's the point, and that's the point of why we can't really work out who this person is, or Jacob couldn't work out initially, because God has been struggling all along that Jacob might struggle and overcome. He'd just done the touch move on Jacob, hadn't he? He could easily have just kicked him off his ankles, but he wants Jacob to overcome. That's the point. He wants Jacob to receive the blessing. That's what this scene's all about. It's getting Jacob to the point where he can see how true blessing is gained, where we can all see how true blessing is gained. How does it come? Well, by admitting defeat and pleading for grace. You've got to lose to win. Centuries later, the prophet Hosea says he struggled with the angel. Jacob struggled with the angel and overcame him. He wept and begged for his favor. Jacob overcomes by weeping and begging. You have to lose to win. See, God will not allow Jacob to enter the promised land as Jacob with all the self-reliance and pride that name carries. He must know that true blessing, true favor, true deliverance only comes by clinging to God in utter dependence, and so must we. And that's what his new name does for him. It reminds the people of God, it reminds us all of how you get true blessing. You see, naming in the Old Testament is always a mark of authority. Children don't name themselves. And there's an authority thing going on here in the naming. Notice that when Jacob asks the man, "What is your name?" verse 29, "Please tell me your name," says Jacob, there's no answer, because there is no authority greater than the one who's just named Jacob. No authority greater than the one who does the touch. He's an I am who I am, I will be who I will be. You can't put God in a box and give him a name. See, Jacob knows what's happened, doesn't he? He names the place Peniel, meaning the face of God. In verse 30 he says, "I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. My life was delivered. My life was saved." See, Jacob had prayed for deliverance from his brother Esau, and he's seen God's face and he's been delivered. And now, therefore, in utter dependence on that God who's delivered him, he can face his greatest fear, his brother, and be delivered. So I think verse 31, as the sun rises on the horizon, it's an image that's supposed to stick in our mind. He left the promised land when the sun was setting, and now he returns as the sun rises. And he's a new man. The main difference is the limp, isn't it? It's a permanent reminder that he carries in his body a kind of badge of honor of how blessing is really won. The grandchildren are probably going to ask him, aren't they, about the limp? And I guess he would smile and say, you've got to lose to win. Great church leader from history, John Calvin, said on this passage, "God fights against us with his left hand and for us with his right." I guess what he means is that God will test and refine his people from relying on anything other than him, to show up that blessing cannot be grabbed, it cannot be won in any other way. And like with Jacob, we'll come back to that in a moment, this is going to hurt, isn't it? So I imagine the cocky young boxer. He steps into the ring, he shuffles his feet, he gives loads of verbal, and the seasoned pro gets into the ring with him, doesn't say anything. He's going to spar with him, and he's not going to knock him out, but he will give him a few knocks. He will knock him about, because he needs to knock out the self-reliance and the pride. In fact, it's a kindness, isn't it? Because he's preparing him for greater and more severe contests that lie ahead. And now, of course, as Jacob does really face up to Esau in the final part, chapter 33, he's about to face the severest of contests, isn't he? Not just with Esau himself, but at the beginning of chapter 33, verse 1, he looks up and there was Esau coming with 400 men. Now, it was going to be tough with Esau when he didn't have a dislocated hip, but now he needs a hip replacement. It's going to be even tougher, isn't it? Impossible. But maybe not after what has just taken place during the night. See, Jacob faces that fear as a changed man, doesn't he? In fact, everything is changed in the next scene. He noticed before he was at the back of the party. Now in verse 3 of chapter 33, he goes on ahead. He's at the front. So he's filled with humility. He bows down to the ground 7 times as he approaches his brother. And then there's a beautiful reconciliation in verse 4. Esau runs out to meet Jacob and embraces him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. No wonder Jesus uses this imagery when it comes to the prodigal son in the New Testament. You see, God is gracious to Jacob, and now there is grace with Esau. It's summed up in verse 10. As Jacob tries to give him all these gifts, he says, "To see your face is like seeing the face of God, now that you've received me favorably." What he means is that by grace he saw God's face and lived, and now he sees Esau's face, and by grace he lives. You see, if he has God's blessing, what is there now to fear? Honestly, at the end of it, what can the world, the flesh, and the devil do to us? The worst thing they can do is the best thing that they can do, which is to unite us with the Lord Jesus and see him face to face. Now, friends, this is the founding story for the people of Israel. It's where they get their name. And so like when the kids will say to us when they grow up, "Why did you call me the particular name?" This is a story that does that for them. It's to remind them how they got it, to remind them where true blessing lies, and to remind them that they need to rely completely on God and not themselves. They're even supposed to remember it by what they would put on the tea table. Do you notice? Verse 32, "Therefore to this day the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon." They're supposed to remember it. And for the thousands of Jacobs who will first read this and go into the promised land, they're going to face plenty of Esau's themselves, aren't they? And their self-sufficiency, their self-reliance on anyone or anything apart from God was not an option for them. As to their cost, they'll find out. They are going to know the painful touch of God to keep reminding them to rely on him. And I guess, therefore, we're not surprised that if this was the pattern for the people of Israel, it's the pattern for the true Israel, the Lord Jesus himself. He knew what it was like to be touched at the very point of life itself, didn't he? Yeah, as with Jacob, in the moment of defeat, in the moment of his greatest weakness, hanging on the cross is the moment of great victory. Jesus knew you have to lose to win. And in that moment, the blessing of salvation was won, wasn't it? As he died in our place. For the blessings we have grabbed at and grasped at anywhere other than the Lord himself. Jesus knew you had to lose to win. And if we're going to follow Jesus, it is the pattern for us too. He will dislocate us. He will show us our sin. He will show us our weaknesses. He will show us circumstances that we did not want to face. All so we will cling to him. You see, the screw fix axe moment, or the child with the cereal, or the parent or the grandparent who can't admit defeat, they all seem such small things, don't they? Laughable, yet they're not. Because they are glimpses, just a glimpse of the heart beneath that is saying, do you know what? I can do this. I can solve it. I know what's what. I am who I am. I will be who I will be. Do you see where it goes? It's serious. All these things always reveal what we actually think about ourselves and think about God. And it may be that we're looking in today and we wouldn't call ourselves Christian when we know we spend our lives wrestling for happiness and fulfillment, or blessing, as we might say. And for a while, the sun can shine, can't it? It seems like we've got it. But then the speed at which the weather draws in can catch us by surprise. I guess COVID has done that to us, hasn't it? And it would be easy in the rush to try and get back to normal that we might deliberately want to forget that what we're tempted to lean on cannot bear us up. To admit we need the touch of God, to see that, to admit that we keep on needing to feel the touch of God is painful. Christopher Ash, the Christian leader, writer, describes this touch of God, he calls it affliction, like the electric fence that's put up by the caring farmer around his sheep. It gives them pain, but it keeps them safe because it keeps them from wandering. In fact, affliction is the most practical evidence that the Father wills us to walk in his way. If he didn't will it, he would not afflict us. Lamentations 3 verse 3 says, he does not willingly afflict or grieve the children of men. You see, it runs counter to all our instincts, doesn't it? Pain is what I want to run away from. But actually, the pain is what confirms us that we are his, and it conforms us in the likeness of his Son. You see, why would we want to rely on him if life was easy? Now, I can't see down the camera this morning, but I do know that the pain is there. And I want to encourage us to let COVID, in a sense, do its work. There have been, there are, and there will be tears. Jacob wept and begged for favour. See, God would have us enter glory limping, but not enter at all.
The refrain of our last song today is, I am bound for the promised land. I am bound for the promised land. It is a cert. It's something that the Christian can have absolute rock solid confidence in, that they are bound to be part of God's eternal promises. And we can be glad as we sing that if we're trusting in Jesus today, because not by our strength, but by his, we are confident in that promise. So what a great song to finish as we sing this last song on Jordan's stormy banks. Before we do, if you are a guest among us, around us, somewhere in your house, watching YouTube today, and you want to find out more about what happens at Trinity Church Sunderland, there is a website, www.trinitychurchsunderland.org, and on that you'll find lots of information about what's happening at the moment, when we're coming back together, what's happening, what kind of activities we do, and more about this person of Jesus Christ. So please head over there if you want. Don't forget there's the Zoom meeting after the meeting, and it'd be great to see everybody there.